One of my clients called me last year asking if he should sell his Perth property. A few months later, he called me again. And then a few months later, he called me again. Each time, the same question. Has the Perth market peaked? And honestly, I could understand why he was asking me that, because Perth prices have shot up since 2021. So many headlines are screaming warnings, and some of your mates are probably telling you, it can't last. Don't buy in Perth. But I've been investing in property now for 23 years, and I've helped over 500 investors in the last 9 years alone. I also predicted the Sydney and Melbourne property booms, the downturns and followed, and the post-COVID property boom that we had. And right now, I'm watching investors on both sides make some catastrophic mistakes. Some are holding on to Perth properties they should have already sold. Others are panic selling quality assets and chasing bargains in poorer markets like Darwin or maybe even the western suburbs of Melbourne, thinking they've found the next property hotspot. But getting this decision wrong doesn't just cost you a few tens of thousands of dollars, as expensive as that is. It can actually lock you into years of stagnant returns while the right market explodes without you. So today, I'm going to show you what's really happening in Perth right now, beyond the headlines, what the data actually says, and the traps buyers need to avoid if they want to make the right move next. The first thing you need to understand is what's really happening right now with prices. You see, many people see an area rise significantly in value and they assume, well, that means then the market has to correct, it's got to crash. They seem to think that rapid price growth in an area always leads to a correction. And I'm seeing this in multiple areas. A lot of people are, for example, saying the same thing about Brisbane. But the fact is, it's total nonsense. You see, buying property, it's not like buying shares where after a steep bull run, people sell to take profits. Property or housing, it's a fundamental human need. People need a roof over their head, so they're not going to sell their homes just because prices rise to take a profit. They still need to live somewhere, not to state the obvious. So then what generally happens after a steep price run, like what Perth had, where it was growing by, over 20% per year, capital growth actually slows down. Now, that doesn't mean prices fall. They still rise. They just don't rise as fast. Now, why does that happen? Human psychology, really. You see, people see prices rise strongly. They keep rising and they get to a point where buyers start to wonder, can prices keep rising? Maybe we should wait and see. So they balk, they wait, they hesitate. Fewer buyers enter the market, so price growth slows. Prices still keep rising though. That's the key point, just not as fast. So then what happens? After a certain amount of time of waiting, buyers go, oh my God, we were hoping for prices to crash. They haven't. Prices are still rising. We need to jump in now before we miss out. And that triggers another wave of buyers, another wave of demand, and another wave of price growth. I've seen this happen so often in the past. That's why I always talk about buying in areas with strong owner-occupier demand. Don't chase investor hotspots, because if you buy in a market with strong fundamentals such as strong owner-occupier demand, what happens is that after taking a breather, the market takes off again. And that's exactly what's happening in parts of Perth right now. In multiple areas, prices have started to rise sharply. Now, to supposedly combat that, the Western Australian state government, in their wisdom, has just introduced a 2% first home buyer scheme. So yes, the federal government has a 5% scheme, but in WA, the state government is allowing people to buy their first home with just a 2% deposit. Now, think about what that means. You're going to have even more buyers entering the market at a time when there are huge supply shortages in multiple areas. The West Australian state government, they're essentially adding fuel to the fire by making it easier for people to buy. Now, as most people trying to buy in many areas around Perth will tell you, the hardest thing now is to find something to buy. And even when they do, they then have to compete with hordes of other buyers. And when you have hordes of other buyers competing for almost every single property, what do you think is going to happen to property prices? The only possible outcome is prices will rise. So always watch what governments do, because when you see government intervention designed to help more buyers into a rising market, that typically fuels demand, driving prices higher. But if you're trying to figure out whether you should buy in Perth right now or someone else, don't guess. Book a free one-on-one call with a member of my team and we'll walk you through how I analyze markets like Perth, suburb by suburb, so you can make confident decisions based on data, not headlines. The link to book that call is in the description below. Now, government schemes, they're just one piece of the picture, because there's something about Perth's physical layout that creates a massive trap for unsuspecting investors. Because many people think Perth is just like any other capital city market. They assume the same rules apply everywhere across the metro area. And look at this photo. You can literally see into people's bedrooms while filling up at the petrol stations. Industrial and residential zones are mixing in ways that would never happen in like Sydney, Melbourne or Brisbane. And why is that happening? It's because Perth, it's the world's longest city. It stretches over 150 kilometers from north to south. And because it's such a long but narrow city, industrial and residential zones are getting mixed together. Now, this is going to create serious problems for many property investors, because you might buy what looks like a residential property, but if it's sitting next to industrial sites, petrol stations, or even commercial operations, that's really going to destroy the rental appeal and capital growth potential. So you cannot buy in Perth based on just price alone. You need to physically understand what's around the property, because a property in a mixed use zone will almost certainly underperform, while many other areas in Perth boom. Now, this raises an obvious question. If you look at a Google map, for example, you can see there's so much land apparently available in Perth. So if that's the case, why are prices rising at all? I mean, surely developers are just building more supply, right? Well, here's what most people get wrong. Many people assume that if there's demand, supply will just automatically follow. Developers will just build more and prices will stabilize. If only that were true. Figures from the Australian Bureau of Statistics, or ABS, show that Perth is doomed to fail when it comes to reaching its infill housing targets. The city is massively underbuilding compared to what's needed. We're not talking about a temporary slowdown, mind you. We're talking about a structural inability to deliver enough housing to meet demand. Approvals are slow. Construction is slow. Land releases, they are not keeping up. This is a supply shortage. Now, supply shortages, they are one of the most powerful drivers for price growth in property. When you can't build enough properties to meet demand, prices rise. It's basic economics, and Perth just can't build fast enough. But a supply shortage on its own, that isn't enough. You also need demand, and demand, well, that comes from people moving to an area and jobs. And that brings me to what's happening with employment. Many people think Perth's economy is still all mining. They assume when commodity prices drop, Perth economy will collapse and property prices will fall. Now, that used to be true in the past, for sure. But the Western Australian economy is more diverse now than it ever has been in the past. For example, the federal government has announced $12 billion towards supporting a defence precinct at Henderson. This will support continuous naval shipbuilding and deliver AUKUS submarines in Western Australia. But $12 billion, that's just the start. Total defence investment from the federal government in Western Australia over the next decade is a whopping $70 million. This isn't mining. This isn't cyclical. This is long-term government-backed infrastructure, creating thousands of high-paying jobs in engineering, manufacturing, logistics, support services, etc. So when you're analyzing property markets, follow the jobs. Sustained employment in multiple industries creates sustained housing demand, and Perth, it's seeing an unprecedented wave of stable, long-term job creation. The jobs are only half the equation. These jobs need to be filled by people, like I alluded to earlier on, and that's where the next data point, it becomes critical. Perth has the fastest rate of population growth in Australia. We're seeing strong interstate migration, people leaving, for example, expensive Sydney, and significant international migration as well. More people are moving to Perth than any other capital city right now. And remember, Perth can't build enough homes to keep up, like I mentioned earlier. So when you combine the fastest population growth in the country with a severe supply shortage, you get sustained upward pressure on prices. More people need homes, not enough homes exist, prices rise. It's really just that simple. So we've looked at prices rising, we've looked at government intervention, supply constraints, massive job creation, and the fastest population growth in the country. Time to answer the question you're probably asking. What does this all mean? Remember the client I mentioned at the start? You know, the one who kept calling me every couple of months to see if he should sell? Well, he called me earlier this month again, and this time he said, "Hey Nero, how come you're always right? If not for you, I would have sold." Now I look at all the data you were talking about, and it's clear prices are not just rising, they're set to rise for quite some time yet. I'm just so glad I didn't sell and that I have you in my corner. As I said, for the past year, he's been calling every 3 months asking the same question. Should I sell before the crash? Every single time I told him no, there's no crash coming, and he finally understands why. So looking at the fundamentals we've just covered, prices rising, government intervention, now that's both state and federal government, by the way, a structural supply shortage, $70 billion in defense investment, among others, and the fastest population growth in the country. It's clear the Perth property market is still strong, prices are still rising, because markets don't work on feelings or gut instincts about what seems too high or prices have risen so much so they have to fall. The market doesn't care. The market works on fundamentals: supply, demand, infrastructure, and jobs. That's it. And right now in Perth, every fundamental indicator is pointing towards sustained price growth, not a market peak. So based on the actual data, has the Perth market peaked? The answer is a clear no. So don't make investment decisions based on what prices have already done. Look at what's driving the market forwards. But before you rush out and buy any property in Perth, you need to hear this next part, because a strong overall market doesn't protect you from making a catastrophic mistakes. And most investors, well, they're about to make exactly that mistake. And why do I say that? It's because, yes, while the overall Perth market will rise in value, not every area will rise in value. You see, many people seem to think that just because a market is rising, that means that all areas in that market are rising. They see Perth boom, for example, and assume, well, let's just buy the cheapest property they can find and they're going to make money. That is where many investors often lose everything. For example, many suburbs in Perth right now are heavily investor dominated. Those suburbs will struggle. Too many investors have bought there, but there aren't enough tenants for those properties. Recent data shows that up to 1/3 of Perth suburbs fell in the last 12 months. So while industry forecasts show Perth is expected to be among the strongest property markets in the country for 2026 and beyond, not all areas and not all price points will rise. Remember the photo I showed you earlier where industrial zones mix with residential, the bedrooms visible from petrol stations? These are in some of those lower price point suburbs. That's where cheap property exists. And those suburbs, they're cheap for a reason. They're in locations that aren't exactly optimal, shall we say. Mixed industrial zones, far away from major emotional hubs, poor infrastructure, little or no amenities. So don't go and chase cheap property in Perth. The market is strong, yes, but only in the right locations. Focus on buying quality properties in well-located suburbs, even if it is a little bit more expensive than the cheaper properties, because things like proximity to employment hubs matter, good amenities matter, avoiding mixed industrial and residential zones matter. Perth is now a very different market to what it was in 2021. Cheaper areas, they are no longer where you want to focus. Many of them will see far less growth than some of the higher quality areas in Perth that will grow a lot more and leave those cheaper areas behind. So now you've seen why Perth is still rising, but also why not every suburb will rise with it. So if you want help to identify, well, where's the best area for you to buy an investment property, book a free, no obligation call using the link in the description below, and I'll walk you through the same framework I use with all of my clients so you can invest confidently and avoid the mistakes so many first-time investors are making as the market heats up. Now, Perth, that's just one piece of the puzzle. If you want to understand how it fits into the bigger picture, where the best opportunities across Australia actually are right now, make sure you watch this next video where I break down the ultimate guide to investing in property in Australia in 2025. It breaks down the data, the risks, the exact strategies the top investors are using this year. I'll see you there.